Let's talk
Okay,
disease.
let's talk disease. So when we started this project, we were looking for a rotational crop that could break the disease cycle of some of the more common diseases of tomato. And we talked about those in the summer. So I'm not going to rehash that. But what we found that most of the diseases of tomato are either specific to solanaceous crops, or at least they don't infect some of the families that we have here. So luckily, the disease portion of this rotation was really easy. The only real problem that we have in these cut flowers is powdery mildew, particularly on the cosmos on the end and on the zinnias that you can't see over the sunflowers. So powdery mildew is really your primary concern, at least since we've seen here in the high tunnel for the fall. And again, Dr. Rudolph mentioned the lettuce that is out of view for those of you on Zoom. We just talked about sclerotinia. So if there was lettuce drop, if there's a history of sclerotinia and lettuce drop is a problem, that's a different conversation. But here in the cut flower high tunnel, powdery mildew is really the only disease we're challenged with. We're in the high input tunnel, and not by high, it's really more like moderate. We're on a low level fungicide schedule. We're just spraying the cut flowers that are susceptible to powdery mildew, and our target is powdery mildew. And on our low input tunnel, which is behind us, we're only spot spraying, as Dr. Rudolph mentioned. So we're spot spraying when we see powdery mildew. And basically, once powdery mildew comes in, it's pretty consistent. It's pretty hard to manage when humidity is within that optimal range. And powdery mildew is typically a problem with cosmos and zinnia, especially with susceptible cultivars. And most of those double and triple petaled zinnias are extremely susceptible. So powdery mildew is what we're looking for. There's not an example here because Dr. Rudolph's group has done a really good job managing powdery mildew here. But one thing about powdery mildew is it overwinters in a structure called chasmathesia, and that's a little tiny, like a Velcro type ball. It's very small, but you can see it with your naked eye. So it looks like black pepper flakes on surfaces of leaves. And those chasmathesia are usually developed right at the end of the season. That's how it overwinters. And the appendages on those little balls are how it grabs onto things. So it'll stick to things, it'll stick to the post, it'll stick to anything around the wood down here, and it's waiting for next year. We've also found that the powdery mildew, the genus Golovenomyces of the powdery mildews here are not host specific. They're pretty broad spectrum. They're a broad range. So a lot of the weeds outside are susceptible to the same powdery mildews. So crop rotation isn't going to fix that issue. We can't eliminate everything outside, even when we're mowing. So some of our very low growing weeds will also be susceptible to this powdery mildew. So in the end, fungicides are going to be your only management option. Don't let it get too bad. So don't wait until the threshold is we're beyond the threshold before spraying. I do recommend some type of preventative powdery mildew management, even if you want that low input, because powdery mildew moves very fast. So it can move up into some of those upper leaves and the bracts, and it can really affect plants. Powdery mildew comes in early, it can affect photosynthesis and plants will be stunted. So don't assume that just because we're going to strip the leaves off, we won't have to deal with with this disease. This is one that we have to manage at some level. So we're working right now on a best management schedule for growers. So we're a little bit conflicted on how much is too much, because in the time between infection and actual disease presence, when we see the disease problem, can be a few weeks. So we don't want to wait until we have severe disease to decide to spray. So we've got to come up with something. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, disease is not a problem in cut flowers in the fall, as far as we've seen. So we had 3 locations last year. This year we have 2 locations because our 3rd location underwent some flooding in Eastern Kentucky this summer in July. So we have 2 locations, and this is our 3rd year. Third year with this project. We've got 2 more after this. And so far, powdery mildew is the only concern in fall cut flowers based on the families that we've chosen here. Right. And we chose these particular flowers because of their days to maturity. So these pro cuts are ready to go usually at almost exactly 60 days from direct seeding. So we direct seeded these. All the other cut flowers we transplanted. And so they all have somewhere between 45 to 65 days to maturity, which, given the unpredictability of the temperatures, it's been a little colder this fall than it was last fall at this time, right? We really do need to make sure we can get a harvest, several harvests in to make it worthwhile. We also, out of view, we have a very thick row cover that when it drops, when the temperature is going to drop below 50 or 40 degrees, we will put the row cover, a giant blanket over everything in this tunnel. So the tunnel gets closed if it drops below 50. This is our rule of thumb. Closed if it drops below 50. Row cover gets put on if it drops below 40. And so that's kind of how we've chosen to manage things. The warmer the better during the day, as far as I'm concerned, this time of year, because we want some ventilation, but we do want some nice heat and some sunny days. So can you remind us, in our previous trials, we had higher yields and in our high input tunnel. So even though we were investing in more pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, we had more yield to make up for it. So right. So far it looks like and again, it's not so much high input as like going by a set recommendation, right, versus the low input would be lower maintenance, only going by scouting, pretty much is kind of the distinction there. But yes, higher yields in the high input. So that means more insecticide, more fungicide on a regular schedule, as well as more fertilizer. And so yes, higher quality typically, and just in general, more production. And two, when we're talking about high input, if these plants were grown during the summer, they would need much higher input. So overall, this is a very low input system. Yes. Even what we're calling high is still a very low input system. So very economical for someone to invest in, even if they're using fungicides and insecticides on a calendar basis. Right. Yes. And so that's the beauty, I think, of this fall project, is looking at alternatives for growers, so they don't all have to grow lettuce in the fall. That is a very common crop, right? And it is a profitable crop, certainly. But is there something else you could grow that would possibly help break the disease and pest cycle, possibly help take up that excess nutrients, and be relatively low maintenance? I don't know if we've definitively answered that question, but okay, I think we're a few years left on this research project. So this is research. So I know a lot of people watch our plots and wonder why we do things. And a lot of this is research, and we do some kind of awkward things to induce pests or to induce disease or to challenge systems, and all things that we wouldn't recommend to growers.